Shalom! Welcome to another edition of Bridges to the Bible. I'm your host, Brian Johnson. Glad to have you here with me today, virtually. Glad you could tune in. So we're going to be talking about the Bible. We're going to be talking about Psalm 23 today. If you tuned in last week or you watched the recording, I went over what I'm calling the bridges to the Bible. The question is, how do we link this ancient world of the Bible to our world? Because the question to ask is, what did it mean to them? And once we understand that, then we can better apply it to ourselves. So just as a bit of a recap, right there. All right, so as a bit of a recap, these were the bridges, the contexts of the Bible that we discussed. So geography, the geographical, looking at location, what are places like, asking where questions. Historical, questions of when or who, and things about what happened in making those connections. Cultural, why did this happen? What are people thinking? What is in their heads? What do they believe? What is daily life like? How do people interact with each other? What's expected of people? Linguistic, the Bible isn't written in English. It's written in Hebrew and Aramaic and Greek. We depend on translations, but some things get lost in translation. And understanding the original can really help. And finally, literary. What other writings are there, or are there other connections within the Bible itself that can shed light on a passage? So what I want to do this week is we're going to look at Psalm 23 in the light of these bridges and ask some of these questions. So what I want to encourage you to do is, as we go into Psalm 23, post some questions based on these bridges, these contexts. As you could say, a really broad question would be, so what is that like? Maybe you could ask it a little more specifically. Starts out as the Lord is my shepherd. Well, what is a shepherd like? Who were shepherds? What was it like to be a shepherd? Would be some great questions to ask. So that just to get you thinking. All right, so let me read it, and then we'll dive in and I'll take a look at what some of the questions are that you wrote there. And then as we go through this today, feel free to leave some comments and questions, and I'll take a look at them at the end and see if there's anything that I didn't address that maybe we can address at the end. So feel free to leave that. All right, so with that, Psalm 23, a psalm of David. The Lord is my shepherd, I shall not want. He makes me lie down in green pastures. He leads me beside the still waters. He restores my soul. He leads me in the paths of righteousness for his name's sake. Yea, though I walk through the valley of the shadow of death, I will fear no evil, for you are with me. Your rod and your staff, they comfort me. You prepare a table before me in the presence of my enemies. You anoint my head with oil, my cup overflows. Surely goodness and mercy shall follow me all the days of my life, and I will dwell in the house of the Lord forever. It's a beautiful psalm. You're probably familiar with it. And there's good reasons why people are so familiar with the psalm. It's a beautiful psalm. It's very relatable even outside of context. You've got some idea what shepherding is like. Although your context might be, shepherding in the United States or different encounters you have there. In the Middle East, it's not the same as it is in North America, however. So let's just see what questions, see if there's any good questions that you came up with. Let's see here. There's a delay in terms of how things come through, so let's see. Yeah, what is it to be in the presence of my enemies? Yeah, that's a good question. Wait for things to catch up here a little bit, see if anyone else has any other ideas here. All right, I think I'm going to move along. So hopefully, if you didn't type something, at least I hope you're at least thinking of some questions. So let's dive in. I thought about doing this not in order of the passage so much, but actually in order of kind of the questions to ask. So we'll be jumping around as we go. So this might be a little confusing, but hopefully it makes sense. All right, so first off, a question of geography. Where is this happening? What does this place look like? Now, at first glance, you might say, well, no location is mentioned. There's no like city name or region. Instead, it's, kind of nameless. And so at first glance, I might say, well, do I just skip this question? Does it not apply here? Because not everything applies equally. But if I tack on where does shepherding take place? Okay, well, now we're talking about a location here. Where is the pasture land for the shepherd? Where does he take his sheep? Let me take you to a map. So this is a map of kind of the southern part of Israel. There are kind of four major zones in this region as you go from west to east. You've got the coast, the coastal plain. First, that is very flat, very wide open. Then you go up in elevation some into the Shfela, the foothills, low rolling hills, broad valleys. Next, you go uphill even more into the hill country. Now you've got steep hills and steep valleys, deep valleys, harder to pass through. And then we get to the final and fourth region, where it then starts to go back down. And that is the Judean wilderness, the desert. Jerusalem is actually right on the line that is at that peak, basically, just before it starts tipping down. Likewise, actually, Bethlehem, south of it. It's not on this map. But both of those are on essentially the line that you've reached the peak and now you're just about to tip over into the desert. And it's in these areas where you will find the sheep and the goats, the flocks with their shepherds. This is the pasture land, because to the west of there is good farmland. So when you get out to pasture land, here you have it, green pastures. Here you can see a couple flocks that I took this picture of. They were kind of out in the distance, grazing on the hillside. Now you got to understand with the climate of Israel that it only rains in kind of the winter time. The rains start to pick up September, October timeframe. It gets harder and harder generally through the winter, December, January timeframe, getting the most. And then it slowly drops off until you get to April or maybe early May as the rains end. And then there's no rain in the summertime. This picture was taken in the February time frame, in that nice green time. So this is a point where you can just see this nice light haze of green. It's enough to get by, but you need to keep on moving. Because when you get to the summer, this is what it looks like. Not a whole lot here. This is still the land of the desert, the land of the shepherd. And there is still a little bit of grass growing in little places, these little tiny tufts that dew will collect on the rocks at night as it cools off, and then there's just enough moisture that little bits will sprout. But what will also happen in the summertime is you see the crops, they grow during the winter when it rains. They get harvested in the spring, and so then the fields are empty. You don't want the flocks out in the fields when the crops are growing. That would not be very good. But in the summertime, the shepherd will take his flocks out into the fields, and they can eat the stubble that's there. They can fertilize the fields, so they're out there for a little while of the year. You think about making a connection when we read in Luke 2 about Jesus being born. It says that there were flocks out, the shepherds are out in the fields at night. Well, if it was December, that's when the crops are growing. You don't go out and you don't have sheep out in the fields in December. Probably more likely that it's summer or perhaps early fall that this was happening instead, given how shepherding works. You don't want to have the flocks out in the fields chewing on the wheat or the barley that's growing. Not a good plan. You'll have a lot of angry farmers. So here you can see a shepherd out with his flock, and in the background you can actually see a field that has been recently harvested. Okay, so that's green pastures. That's where the pasture land is. But there's more to look at in terms of the geography that'll help us understand this psalm. This is at Qumran, where the Dead Sea Scrolls were found. This cave that's here, that is cave 4, where a big cache of the scrolls were found. But that's not why I'm pointing this out. I want you to look up. This is a wadi. And a wadi is a canyon. Now, if you see this kind of V shape, this carved out area, how did it get to be like that? Well, it's from water streaming through it, which is dry in this picture and dry the vast majority of the year. And this brings us to our second bit of imagery that says, "He leads me beside quiet waters." And the question is, well, what are quiet waters? Well, I think a first way to answer that is, what are not quiet waters? Because every so often there is rain here, or rain just upstream. And that's when this happens. As the water cascades down into these canyons and just shoots on through. It's not getting absorbed at all. It's rock, and even the sandy area doesn't really absorb the water, and it just cascades and shoots through, and anything in its way is blown away. I found this picture online. Hopefully I can see this in person sometime from a safe distance, not from within the canyon. People die every year who are out hiking in these. It's a beautiful sunny day and it's raining 10, 20 miles away up in the hills, and they get swept away. They're always sad stories. So this is what is not quiet waters. Sheep aren't going to enjoy this, and the shepherd isn't going to enjoy the sheep being a part of this either. So what would quiet waters look like? Something more like this. that you've got these pools of water that collect after these floods, or that get even just, or after rains that just kind of collect in there. Sheep are, well, they're sheepish, they're skittish. They don't even like just gently flowing water. They want still water. And actually the Hebrew there is my menuchot, waters of rest. That's just quiet and still waters, but waters of rest. And sort of waters that it's like, we've had a long day of hiking and wandering and chewing, nibbling here and there, but now we can settle down and just rest. More in those canyons, though, that we can see in the imagery. This deep, dark valley. Why describe the desert, this area, in terms of the shadow, land of the shadow of death? I mean, it's a bright land. And you get out there, it's in the sunshine, you're baking, you've got these light-colored rocks that are reflecting back at you, and you're just being blinded by it. Until you then come to shade, of which there's a lot of shade in these deep canyons like this. And your eyes are not going to immediately adjust. They're not necessarily going to notice it well. And particularly when it gets dark out, these canyons are really dark, and it's possible to not see them, especially if you don't have any lights like we do now. So these can be dangerous. And if you're not following the shepherd and you don't know where you're going, it would be very easy to fall off. This is several hundred feet deep. He leads me on paths of righteousness. You see these paths, these little lines that are going through here? Those are ruts that come from the sheep as they're going along their way. So they create paths. Now, they just kind of crisscross, go here and there, but at points they do diverge. And if you're not following the shepherd who knows where he's going, you could end up going the wrong way. He leads me on the right path. So just asking these things of where and what do these images look like in the location, the physical locations here in the psalm is actually just packed. And the author just assumes that you know what these places look like. Because back then, everyone did. Whether you were a shepherd or not, you had some sense of what these places were like. All right, I am going to go through the other 4 things, but they won't take as long as this one. This was the biggest one. And also, yeah, they're kind of overlap too. Next would be history. Yeah. Who wrote this? Who's this about? And that's an easy one. It says at the beginning, a Psalm of David. King David. Well, what do we know about him? Well, he's king. And how did he start out? As a shepherd. He's writing about something he knows. He knows these deserts. This isn't something he heard from somebody else and said, oh, that's beautiful imagery. I'm going to write a song about it. No, he's writing it from personal experience. Another interesting question, though, and this is more speculative. When did he write it? I mean, obviously, if David wrote it, it was sometime during his lifetime. So we can pin it down there, but when in his lifetime? Did he write it when he was a boy, out tending his father's flock? Then it's just the act of this is what life is. Then he comes into King Saul's service. He's fighting battles. Was it then? Reflecting back. Or then he has this fallout with Saul, and Saul is paranoid and trying to kill him, and David goes on the run. And much of that time is spent, once again, in the desert. These deserts that David knew. And maybe some of his advantage with escaping Saul was because these were regions that David knew and where to go and where not to go. Is he writing it then? That he's like, I was a shepherd out here, but God is my shepherd leading me through here. Perhaps. Maybe it's later than that. He's sitting in Jerusalem as king, relaxing back, and more just reflecting of God's guidance of him throughout his life. Perhaps it's when he's on the run from his son Absalom. And where does he escape? He heads east into the desert. So it adds a bit of a different flavor of where he's writing this. And there's no answer to that. It doesn't say. So a few Psalms actually do give a context of when this was written. This does not. But it does give a flavor. So I'll leave it up to you to decide what you think might work best. But it definitely adds some flavor to it when you ask these when sort of questions. Next, culture. What was it like being a shepherd? And we've already hit on some of this in terms of the geography and the terrain, dealing with that. But are there any customs to being a shepherd? And just one example talks about your rod and your staff, they comfort me. Here's a shepherd that met up with one time, and you can see his staff in hand. His walking stick. His staff is used for walking, helping to guide the sheep. If he falls, if he stumbles, and there's a cliff there, hopefully that can stop him to help there. Rod is actually the root of it is a verb for to strike, to hit. Not striking the flock, but for striking any enemies of the flock, whether two or four-legged enemies that might attack the flock or do harm. It's a defense tool. Language. What does the original Hebrew say? Is there any vivid imagery that just doesn't translate real well into English, or connections that could be made? The phrase, he restores my soul. This is actually two words in Hebrew, nafshi yeshovev. My soul, he restores. Soul in Hebrew is the word nefesh, which means, when we say soul, we've got a particular image in English in our culture, but the best way to picture it would be if you said, you picture like an airline accident, they talk about there were so many souls on board. That's kind of the way the Hebrew would use the word soul. It's your life. It's actually kind of literally your throat, your breath, that you are breathing, that you're alive. And restores comes from the Hebrew word shuv, which means to return, to turn around. He returns my soul to me. Life was tough, things were getting bad, and he took my soul and brought it back to be where it needs to be. I was wandering in the desert lost, and I was worried for my life, but he has brought me back. Another interesting word that I think that could be translated a little bit better, but it's kind of a strange way to do it, is surely goodness and mercy shall follow me all the days of my life. Shall follow me. The Hebrew word radaf. But more often, radaf is actually translated as pursues or persecutes. Here's another example down below here from Exodus 14 of the exact same word, radaf, being used. The people of Israel have just escaped from Egypt. They're just getting into the desert, and they haven't even gotten to the Red Sea yet to cross. It says, and the Lord hardened the heart of Pharaoh, king of Egypt, and he pursued the people of Israel while the people of Israel were going out defiantly. He pursued them. He's not just kind of following along. No, he is after them. I think that's the same, what's being described here. It's not simply following. It's more active than that. Goodness and mercy are after me, which is actually a positive image, but using it, which I think is why they're translated as follow rather than pursue, because it's like, it sounds kind of strange. But I think he's using this vivid imagery. You know, like in the shepherd, you might have a fox pursuing a young lamb. It's after it. But you know what? For me, I've got a good shepherd. I'm not worried about some enemy pursuing me. In fact, what's pursuing me is goodness and mercy. Tov v'hesed. Tov, good, chesed, mercy, loving kindness. It's love that you experience between a close relative or a good friend, someone that you are in a relationship with. Chesed, a great word. Some literary context. Are there any other connections in the Bible that we can make here? Or connections with any other ancient texts? I'm just going to focus on just a little bit in the Bible itself. There are multiple passages that talk about God as shepherd. Psalm 23 is not unique in this. Psalm 78, for instance, it's a long psalm that's depicting the people going through the wilderness and from the Exodus and then coming into the land, and it's telling that story again, basically. And part of it is it depicts God as shepherding his people in the desert, which is exactly where you typically have shepherds. But God, made his people go forth like sheep and guided them in the wilderness like a flock. Or another one from Isaiah 40, verse 11, he will feed his flock like a shepherd. He will gather the lambs with his arms. God as a shepherd. Just a couple examples of that, but there's others. I mean, you think about Jesus calling himself the Good Shepherd in John. Making another, maybe a little more specific word connection rather than just a topic. The Lord is my shepherd, I shall not want. I lack nothing. I shall not lack. Deuteronomy 2:7, in the end of those wilderness wanderings, Moses says, the Lord your God has blessed you in all the work of your hands. He has watched over your journey through this vast desert. These 40 years, the Lord your God has been with you, and you have not lacked anything. Same word that's used. So just as God guided them in the desert like a shepherd, they didn't lack anything. And so David also, the Lord is my shepherd, I lack nothing. So I hope that you've, maybe the imagery for Psalm 23 is a little stronger for you now. I hope that there's a few images that has popped up. The Bible's a picture book. It's not just a bunch of pages and a bunch of words, but it has vivid imagery that it's conveying. If you know what that imagery is, it just assumes you do. So I'm going to read through Psalm 23 one more time, and I just want you to listen to these words from these green pastures. And as you listen to them again, I certainly haven't hit on everything, but is there at least one or two things that maybe was new to you, or an image that pops into your mind now as we read this that maybe wasn't there when we read it a few minutes ago? Psalm 23, a psalm of David. The Lord is my shepherd, I shall not want. He makes me lie down in green pastures. He leads me beside the still waters. He restores my soul. He leads me in the paths of righteousness for his name's sake. Yea, though I walk through the valley of the shadow of death, I will fear no evil, for you are with me. Your rod and your staff, they comfort me. You prepare a table before me in the presence of my enemies. You anoint my head with oil. My cup runs over. Surely goodness and mercy shall follow me, shall pursue me all the days of my life, and I will dwell in the house of the Lord forever. Before turning, just see if there's any questions. I'm just going to have just a quick thing here about just a few things coming up, and then we'll turn to see if we've got any questions that we want to talk about. Once again, glad you could come. I'm glad that you're watching. If you go to my website at bridgestothebible.com or you follow the Facebook page, Bridges to the Bible, I'm continuing on a weekly series through the book of Jeremiah, 1 chapter per week. Just looking at this various imagery and just different things that kind of stand out to me from the book of Jeremiah. So just tune in for those Sunday evenings. The next one will be up pretty soon this evening. Last fall, I was in Egypt, and then I started blogging about my experiences there. And then life sort of just happened and it kind of got dropped. I am picking that back up though now. So hopefully, Lord willing, in a week or two, I will start blogging about Egypt again. So if you want to hear about my travels in Egypt and understand a little bit more about the land of Egypt, stay tuned for that and follow along there. Other thing, I've added a resources page to the website. It still has some more things that need to be filled out, but at least it's a great start. It's got some nice links to various websites I've really enjoyed, things that I find valuable, and some other things too, and more will be added over time. So this was the second video I had planned. I do not currently have any other videos planned at this exact moment in time. I wanted to basically do these and try to see how things went, what sort of feedback I got, how do I feel about how this went, and take it from there. So stay tuned. More could be on the way. We'll see. I'm sure at least at some point some new material there video-wise will be posted. But would love to hear what you think about this. What works? What didn't work? Is it good to be doing this live? Should I just record it? I don't know. I'd also love to get back to teaching in person too one of these days. So with that, let's switch over to some questions and see. Let me get back to that mode. All right, and let's see if there's any questions. So, being in the presence of your enemies. Let's see here. Let me bring sound back up. So, prayer table before me in the presence of my enemies, before my enemies. I think it's to the face of my enemies is usually how that's usually in Hebrew done. And I'm realizing I don't have Hebrew open, so I'm going to pop that open here. There we go. So when you've got a table before me in the presence, if you're with your enemies in their presence, then the hope then is if you're sitting down at the meal with your enemies, that means you've made peace with them. And so I think it's of those who were your enemies that things are working out quite a bit better. Let me look here. Prayer table, just opposite that, opposite what is in front of you, before my foes, those who treat me with hostility or who want to attack me. So it's not simply someone who's an enemy, but someone who's just outright hostile. So to be able to do that and sit down and enjoy. So if it's not making peace with them, then it would seem that despite them being around, you can sit down and enjoy a meal and not have to worry about them. It's a comforting feeling. What's the shepherd's place in society? A shepherd, if you look in the Bible, there's a number of places that shepherds are kind of looked down on. They're not super positive. On the other hand, they're also very important. They're definitely lower class type people. The farmers are generally deemed more important. But on the other hand, you've got everyone coming out of the land of Egypt who's essentially a shepherd. So how that all plays, it's the class that you don't really like a whole lot, but there is at least some respect for it. And certainly this image of God as shepherd, the king as the shepherd over the nation. So it's kind of a complicated bit of imagery of pluses and minuses all around. I'll explain why I shall not want. Does it mean I shall not be in need? And I think that is a great question. So you think about this. Generally, when I used to read Psalm 23, I would look at, he makes me lie down in green pastures. It's this lush, fertile field with all this grass and more than I could possibly ever need, right? Well, that's not what it's like for the land of the shepherd. That's not what it's like at all. Now, there are times when you get out in those fields and there just is a lot there. And you are not just taken care of, but well taken care of. But there are other times, other seasons where you're out in the desert and it's a little nibble here, a little nibble here, and it's the only way you're going to have enough is by following the shepherd. And I think that's the interesting thing about this psalm, is that in a place like the desert that seems to lack everything, somehow I lack nothing. I don't think that necessarily means that there aren't needs. There are. The flock has needs, but we've got a good shepherd who is guiding us and leading us to take care of those needs as he deems fit. So I think just like there's those seasons of the sheep and the shepherd, so there are those seasons in our lives as well. This is a great question. How far did your average shepherd range with his flock? That could be quite a range. For instance, think about, you've got Joseph and his brothers, and Joseph is down, I think it either says like Beersheba or Hebron or somewhere down in that area. So point being, in the south. And Jacob, his father, says, hey, go check on your brothers. They're up north. And so he heads up north and ends up at Dothan, we say. And we're talking over 100 miles here. So the shepherds get around. It's not that they're doing that, in a day or 2 days or 5 days. It's very slowly moving the flock along. But yeah, shepherds can make, of course, then eventually the idea is they're going to come back. So they can have a circuit that's, a couple 100 miles, round trip. I could also, I think in terms of David and the wilderness, he's probably more like his full circuit is maybe 50 to 100 miles. So I'd say it's certainly at least 10, 20 miles out from Bethlehem, which is sitting right on the edge of the desert. Definitely pasture land. Does my cup runs over have any cultural meaning? I was reading a little bit on this and trying to see if there was anything else I could find. And it feels like in verse 5 that it kind of starts to switch metaphors. So I'm trying to understand exactly what's going on there, just to say, okay, you're setting out a table before me, and part of that is having a cup filled with water, or probably in terms of filled with wine. And having a cup running over, it's saturated, it's an overabundance. He's got more than he needs. It's just flowing. Let the wine just keep flowing. Life is good. It's the good life. That's the best I can understand it. If there's something more to that, I'm not sure at this moment in time. But I have a feeling I'm probably missing a little something there. But I don't think I'm super far off. But there's probably a little more imagery there. Are there any dual meanings of words in this psalm? I think I've pretty well hit on. I don't think there's. I'm trying to think here, just skimming through it, if there's anything that jumps out. I wouldn't say any dual meanings. Some of the things I mentioned that, follow versus pursue. That's probably the most extreme. So most of these, it could just, I would say more that some of the things that I gave examples that might have, some additional meaning. This psalm is a popular one for funerals today. How far back does that go? Would it have been used for any sort of funeral back in ancient Israel? Or if not, was this a popular psalm back then? I have no idea about this. That is an interesting question, though. When does something get picked up for instance, a funeral? Was it used for that back then? I would guess not, but that is simply a guess. More often, these are worship songs that are being sung. Understand that the psalms were set to music, typically. Unfortunately, we've lost the tune, so we don't know what that sounded like. Was it popular back then? Hard to say. I would venture yes, to some extent. Was it? I'd say this is probably, at least in our culture, probably the most popular psalm, most widely known. Was this one back in, let's say, in Jesus' day? After David's day, the psalms weren't a collection, and that would develop over time. But let's say by Jesus' day, was it? I'm sure it was super well known. Certainly, of course, all of Scripture was to them. Our culture, we don't know a whole lot compared to them. But you even see, in Mark, when Jesus feeds the 5,000, it says, Jesus saw the crowds when he got there, and he said they were like sheep without a shepherd. And then after he preaches them and says, hey, let's feed them, what does he do? He says he has them sit down on the green grass. And it's interesting that none of the other Gospels mention the green grass. They just say they sit down. And I look at that and say, why do I need to know that? Why does he give this specific phrase of talking about green grass and has them sit down? He makes me lie down in green pastures. I shall not want. He's going to take care of their needs because they're like sheep without a shepherd, and he is going to be their good shepherd and take care of them. And he performs this amazing miracle of feeding the 5,000. So I think people certainly knew this psalm. And I love how you put popular in quotes. I think that's a great way to put it. In terms of popularity, certainly would work differently for them. I hope this was helpful. I hope you enjoyed that. So with that, I am very thankful that you could tune in. Let's see here. So as to scan through, because I can't, read these things while I'm doing all that, and see if there's anything else to. I am glad you guys could chime in. Great questions. I hope this helped you out some. So that's going to be it for tonight. God bless. Lech Shalom. Go in peace.